We're living in a world where, well, it often feels like power and control are pretty concentrated, aren't we?
Hmm.
You look at, the huge tech platforms, central governments, big financial institutions. That centralization can feel, well, pretty dominant sometimes.
It certainly can, yeah. And it's really in response to that feeling of concentration that this whole idea of decentralization comes up.
Right.
Fundamentally, it's just about distributing power or control or maybe information away from a single central point.
Spreading it out.
Exactly, spreading it out. It's actually quite an old idea, but it's definitely having a bit of a moment right now, hasn't it? Especially with all the new technologies emerging.
Absolutely. A huge moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely what we're planning to dive into today. We've gathered, well, quite a stack of source material.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from, academic papers, expert guides, to sort of technical deep dives and articles. And our mission, really, is to pull out the most important bits from all of this.
Yeah, distill it down.
Yeah, distill it. We want to give you, the listener, a really clear picture of what decentralization actually means. Where did it come from? Where are we seeing it pop up today? Why do people think it matters so much? And crucially, what are the big hurdles, the challenges it faces?
Think of this as your sort of shortcut to getting your head around a concept that's genuinely shaping quite a lot. How tech is built, how businesses might run in the future. We'll try and be your guides through the material, point out the key nuggets.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's kick things off. Let's try and unpack this word itself. Decentralization? It feels like you hear it everywhere now, but
Yeah.
sometimes...
Well, it's not always crystal clear what people mean by it.
Agreed. Yeah, it can be a bit of a buzzword. But at its heart, it's pretty simple. It's the opposite of centralization.
Right.
So instead of decisions in authority being concentrated at one point, maybe at the top, it's spread out, dispersed through the organization or the system.
So it means not everything has to go up the chain to the big boss for a decision. Exactly that, yeah. There's a quote one source uses attributed to Henri Fayol that puts it quite neatly. He said something like, everything which goes to increase the importance of a subordinate's role is decentralization. Everything that goes to reduce it is centralization.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it's a nice contrast. So if you're giving people lower down the ladder, so to speak, more responsibility and more power to make calls, you're decentralizing.
That really clarifies it. And I think it's worth stressing, it's not just a simple on-off switch, is it? A system isn't just decentralized or centralized. It's more like a spectrum.
It's absolutely a spectrum, yeah. And what's really interesting, I think, is that a system can be decentralized in some ways, but still quite centralized in others. It's not uniform.
Ah, okay.
Some of the sources we looked at break this down into different sort of dimensions, which I think helps add a bit of much-needed nuance.
Right, the different dimensions. That feels really important if you want to cut through the jargon. What are they then?
Well, one viewpoint highlights three main types. First off, there's architectural decentralization.
Okay.
This is basically about the physical setup. How many computers or nodes are actually in the system and how spread out are they, geographically speaking?
Got it. So, like comparing a network of servers dotted all over the world versus, say, one enormous data center in one place, the scattered one is more architecturally decentralized.
Spot on. Then, number two, you've got political decentralization. Now, this is about control. Who actually holds the power to make the decisions?
Right.
How many different people or groups control the system? And is that power shared out evenly, or is it concentrated in just one or maybe a few hands?
Okay, so physical spread versus control spread. And the third one was logical decentralization.
Yes, logical decentralization. This focuses more on the sort of data structure itself. Does the system act like one single coherent unit, even if it's physically spread out? Or is the underlying database itself fragmented, maybe replicated, and kept in sync across lots of different nodes?
Ah, I see. So maybe like a traditional single company database versus something like a blockchain, a distributed ledger, where the data itself is copied and managed by the whole network.
Precisely. That's a great example. The blockchain case would be more logically decentralized.
Okay, so this is key then.
Yeah.
You could have a system, theoretically, with servers everywhere, making it architecturally decentralized. But if one company owns and controls all of them,
then it's still politically centralized.
and maybe logically centralized too, if it all funnels back to their main database structure. The course has mentioned things like big cloud providers, like AWS, didn't they?
They did. Amazon Web Services, yeah, they have server farms all over the globe for speed and resilience. That's architectural decentralization, definitely.
Right.
But Amazon ultimately controls those servers, the software, the underlying data structures. So from a political and logical standpoint, it's much more centralized. Understanding which dimension someone's actually talking about is, well, it's crucial when you hear claims about decentralization.
That adds a really vital layer of clarity.
Okay, so while we hear decentralization talked about a lot now, especially with crypto and blockchain and things, this isn't some brand new idea, is it? It didn't just spring up with the internet, it has a history.
It really does. A
Yeah.
surprisingly long one, actually.
Yeah.
The sources trace the words themselves back to revolutionary France.
Really?
Yeah. Centralization apparently first popped up around 1794,
Yeah.
just after the main terror as the Directory was trying to build the new French state
Wow. And decentralization, the French word, followed soon after.
in the 1820s, yeah. And both terms apparently made their way into English not long after that.
And it seems this push and pull, this tension between centralizing and decentralizing, has been around for ages. You mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville earlier.
Yes, the famous French observer of America. He noted quite perceptively that the French Revolution actually kicked off with a push towards decentralization.
Sure.
People wanted power distributed.
But kind of paradoxically, he argued it ended up leading to an extension of centralization. The state became, in some ways, more powerful and centralized than the monarchy it replaced.
That's fascinating, how that desire for distributed power can sometimes, maybe unintentionally, swing back the other way.
Yeah.
So beyond just political theory, decentralization has also been used as a practical tool, right, in public policy, especially more recently.
Very much so, particularly from the 1980s onwards, actually. It became a pretty common strategy in many developing countries, often with encouragement and funding from international aid organizations.
Right.
The sources mention, for example, that lots of decentralization efforts across Africa have been really long-term processes, stretching back decades. And their success, or lack thereof, is incredibly sensitive to the local situation, the context, and they vary hugely in how they're actually put into practice.
And there was a UN report, wasn't there, back in 1999 from the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. They actually tried to link this growing global trend towards decentralization to some bigger forces happening in the world then.
They did. They pointed to a few key things. One was a growing mistrust, maybe disillusionment with central governments in many parts of the world.
Okay.
Another was the collapse of very highly centralized states like the Soviet Union, which obviously opened up space for different models. Then you had rising demands for separatism or regional autonomy in various places.
And just a general desire for more participation.
Exactly. A stronger push from ordinary citizens and also the private sector wanting a bigger say in how things were run. So it wasn't just an idea cooked up by policy wonks. There was pressure from below, too.
A mix of factors pushing in the same direction. It even became like a core principle for some political movements.
Yeah, the U.S. Green Movement, for instance, listed decentralization as one of its 10 key values way back in 1983.
And there were economic pressures too, weren't there? Especially around the 80s. Calls for reform because big, centralized state organizations weren't seen as very efficient anymore.
That's right. Some sources point to the fact that in many countries, particularly after independence, large public bodies had taken over huge chunks of the economy, like providing all agricultural services, for example.
Becoming monopolies almost.
Effectively, yes. And sometimes these huge organizations could become, well, maybe less focused on delivering the service and more focused on their own survival or expansion. Top-heavy, bureaucratic.
And when the economic winds changed, perhaps external aid patterns shifted.
The inefficiency became harder to ignore, and the pressure built for reform. And you mentioned the big international financial institutions earlier.
The IMF, the World Bank.
Exactly. Their structural adjustment programs, which were very influential in that era, often included recommendations for decentralization as part of the reform package.
Aimed at cutting deficits, improving efficiency.
Yeah, the goals were complex, often tied to broader economic liberalization. But shifting responsibilities away from central government was frequently part of the prescription. Although, as with many reforms, the actual results on the ground were, well, varied.
Right. So we can see decentralization has these deep roots, political history, public administration reforms. It's not just a tech thing, which leads us nicely into, okay, where do we actually see it being applied today? Because it seems to crop up in a surprising number of different fields.
It really does. One of the most obvious places is still in government and governance. That's kind of its traditional home, in a way.
And the basic idea there is still about shifting power away from the center.
Pretty much. Distributing decision-making authority from the central government down to more local levels, regions, districts, municipalities, that sort of thing.
And the sources actually broke down the different ways this can happen administratively, almost like levels of decentralization.
That's right. It's a spectrum again. At the sort of weakest end, you have what's called deconcentration.
Okay.
This is really just the central government putting its own officials out in different regional or district offices to carry out central government tasks locally. The power hasn't really left the central government itself.
Just geographically dispersed.
Exactly. A step further is delegation. This is where the central government creates separate bodies, maybe public corporations, special authorities, and gives them the responsibility and some discretion to manage specific functions, like running the water supply or managing a port.
Okay. Getting a bit more autonomy there.
A bit more. Then you get to devolution, which is generally seen as a stronger form. Here, you're actually transferring real authority, responsibilities, and resources to subnational units of government that are genuinely independent, like elected regional or local councils.
They have their own power base.
They do. And then at the furthest end of the spectrum, you have divestment or privatization.
Right. Selling things off or contracting out.
Yeah, where the government basically hands over responsibility for providing a service entirely to the private sector, or maybe to nonprofit organizations. One source made the point that historically many of these functions were private before governments gradually took them over anyway.
Interesting point. So that's administrative power. What about money? There's fiscal decentralization too.
Yes, fiscal decentralization, sometimes called fiscal federalism. This is all about giving those lower levels of government more control over raising their own money through local taxes, perhaps, and deciding how to spend it.
Makes sense. Give them responsibility, give them the budget to match. But the sources flagged a potential issue here, didn't they?
They did. It's that if you decentralize the money side, the fiscal part, without also giving real decision-making authority, you could paradoxically increase central control.
How so?
Well, if local governments become totally dependent on money transferred down from the central government, the center can then pull the strings through those transfers. It also creates challenges in managing what they call vertical imbalances, basically, mismatches between what local governments are expected to do and their actual capacity to raise the money to pay for it.
A tricky balancing act, then.
Definitely. And it's not just about formal government. The sources also brought in the role of civil society organizations, CSOs.
Right, like community groups, NGOs, charities.
Exactly. Groups formed around common interests or values. They're seen as part of the broader governance landscape, operating at all levels, from the very local up to the international.
And they can partner with government, but with potentially more independence.
Yes, the idea mentioned was partnerships in development. They might get some public funding, but the sources suggest CSOs often have more autonomy in deciding how to tackle a problem, designing their own strategies and projects, compared to simple delegation where the government just tells them what to implement.
And the political angle on all this is that decentralization is often linked to strengthening democracy.
Yeah, the argument is it brings government closer to the people, makes it more responsive, enhances participation, and is tied up with ideals of, democracy, equality, liberty.
Okay, so that's government. But we're also seeing companies experiment with this stuff, right? In business and organizations.
We are, yeah. It's not just the public sector. Some companies are exploring much more decentralized ways of operating, moving away from rigid top-down hierarchies.
Any examples stand out?
One really interesting case study mentioned in the sources was a Japanese IT company called Umemi.
Okay.
They introduced some pretty radical practices, things like an everyone CEO system, where basically all employees get access to company information and decision-making power, usually reserved for the top.
Wow.
They let employees set their own salaries within certain frameworks, and they distributed tasks typically done by middle managers, resource allocation, performance reviews, that kind of thing, to voluntary groups of employees called guild committees.
So they're basically decentralizing management itself, pushing it out to self-organizing teams. That sounds like a massive cultural shift.
It's huge, yeah. It allows teams to kind of assess their own needs and allocate resources more directly. So you can see decentralization isn't just abstract theory. It's influencing how some companies are literally structured and run day to day.
Fascinating. And then, of course, the area where maybe most people hear about it now, technology and computing.
Ah, yes, the digital realm. This is where the concept has really taken off in recent years, often linked to the internet and newer stuff like blockchain.
So what does it mean in tech terms?
Well, fundamentally, decentralized computing involves networks made up of independent systems, independent computers, or nodes, where each part can potentially be equally important. They connect and share resources or information without necessarily needing a central coordinator.
And the ultimate example is the internet itself.
Often held up as the prime example, yes. One source had that great line, "No one is in charge of internet, and everyone is."
I like that.
Anyone can connect, anyone can offer services, as long as they follow some basic open protocols. There are bodies that help set standards, sure, but there's no single company or government that can just switch it off or dictate exactly how it evolves.
Unlike maybe older network models, what about other examples?
Well, things like Wikipedia being the obvious giant, where content is created and edited collaboratively by users, even smartphones, putting powerful computers in billions of pockets globally, contribute to decentralization in a way. And the sources mention things like wireless mesh networks using lots of small routers instead of relying solely on big, centralized mobile phone towers.
It sounds like there's always this kind of tension in IT management, isn't there? Trying to balance the desire for central control, maybe for security or cost savings, versus the flexibility and resilience you get from decentralizing things.
Absolutely. It's a constant push and pull. And it's interesting, the sources also noted this historical link between some countercultural thinking back in the 60s and 70s, people like Stuart Brand and the whole Earth catalog,
Right.
and the early days of personal computing. This idea of technology empowering individuals, creating more decentralized electronic frontier,
Yeah.
that influenced things like the free software movement too.
Right. And fast forwarding to today, we've got the whole explosion of decentralized finance or DeFi. That's trying to shake up banking, isn't it?
It is. DeFi is basically trying to build an alternative financial system, often using blockchain technology, that cuts out the traditional middlemen.
So cutting out the banks, the brokers, the payment processors.
Exactly. The aim is to allow peer-to-peer transactions directly between users, reducing fees, and crucially, giving users more direct control over their own assets.
So instead of a bank holding your money for you, you hold the private keys to your digital wallet, controlling your funds directly.
That's the core idea. And transactions get recorded on a public blockchain, which proponents say makes them transparent and very hard to tamper with or reverse.
It's aiming for a financial system that's potentially permissionless. Anyone can join in, and more open and maybe more resilient than the old ways.
That's the vision, yes. More transparent, potentially more efficient, and accessible to anyone with an internet connection.
Okay, another sector where this idea is popping up is energy. How does that work?
Well, decentralization in energy is often about moving away from the old model of huge, centralized power stations sending electricity over long distances.
Well,
Instead, it's about encouraging more local energy generation. Think solar panels on roofs, small wind turbines, maybe community energy projects, often using renewable sources.
and these local sources can be connected together.
Often, yes, into what are called microgrids. These can sometimes operate independently if the main grid goes down, boosting local resilience. It's also linked to the idea of self-reliance.
And the sources mentioned prosumers, people who both consume and produce energy.
Exactly. With things like solar panels, you might generate more power than you need at certain times, and you could potentially sell that excess back to the grid or even trade it locally. Some concepts involve using blockchain for transparent energy trading or AI to help optimize energy use and manage these more complex distributed grids.
So the microgrids can actually help support the main grid too.
They can, yeah. By providing local power, they can reduce strain on the big transmission lines and potentially improve overall stability.
The sources also give a quick mention to other areas too, didn't they? Things like agriculture services, water purification systems, even supply chains for transport and logistics.
That's right. It shows the breadth of it. The concept is being explored or applied in all sorts of systems where distribution might offer advantages over concentration.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive tour of where we see decentralization.
Yeah.
But let's get to the crux of it. Why? Why does it matter? What are the actual benefits people point to? The sources seem to make a pretty strong case for several key advantages.
They certainly did. One of the big ones that comes up repeatedly is empowerment and initiative.
Right.
When you push decision-making down the chain, whether it's in a business or a government agency, it can really foster a sense of ownership and self-reliance in people at lower levels.
Yeah, one source mentioned it helps identify potential leaders, gives people a chance to actually use their skills and training in meaningful ways. It encourages them to step up.
Exactly. And that empowerment can lead directly to greater efficiency and speed. Well, if decisions don't have to constantly travel up multiple layers of bureaucracy for approval and then back down again, things can just happen much faster.
Especially at the local level, right? Local teams or local government branches, they know their specific situation best. They can react quickly without waiting for headquarters.
Precisely. Fewer layers, better local knowledge. Plus, it frees up the people at the very top. They can stop getting bogged down in every little operational detail and focus more on the big picture, the strategy, long-term planning.
That makes sense. Another huge one, particularly for technical systems, is resilience and reduced risk. This seems core.
It really is. If you distribute the critical parts of a system or the control over it, you dramatically reduce the risk of a single point of failure taking the whole thing down.
Yeah, if one server crashes in a distributed network, the others can pick up the slack. Unlike a centralized system where if the main hub goes offline, well, everything stops.
Exactly. The sources really highlighted this for things like blockchains. One mentioned Ethereum's remarkable uptime record over years. That kind of resilience is very difficult for a centralized service to guarantee, especially when facing attacks or unexpected surges in demand.
No single throat to choke, as they sometimes say.
That's the idea. Then there's the potential for increased transparency and accountability.
How does decentralization help there?
Well, if more people or entities are involved in making decisions, the processes themselves can become more open and visible. In government, for example, the argument is that local officials are closer to the people they serve and therefore more directly accountable to them.
And in the tech examples, like those public blockchains we talked about.
The fact that the transaction ledger is typically public and auditable by anyone provides a level of transparency that's just fundamentally different from traditional closed, centralized systems. Real-time data is often available too.
Okay. What about fostering new ideas, innovation, and adaptability?
Yes, that's another key argument. When you allow different departments or local units or even different projects built on a decentralized platform to operate with more autonomy, it can create a kind of healthy competition.
Encouraging them to experiment, find better ways of doing things.
Exactly. Local areas or teams can try out different approaches tailored to their specific needs or conditions. This fosters innovation and makes the whole system potentially more adaptable when circumstances change.
And there was that idea of permissionless innovation, wasn't there? Particularly with things like DePIN, decentralized physical infrastructure networks.
Right. The idea is that if the underlying network or protocol is open, anyone can build new services or applications on top of it without needing approval from some central gatekeeper. This could allow new ideas to emerge and evolve much faster than in a centrally controlled ecosystem.
Leading potentially to improved service delivery and governance overall.
That's the hope. Services can potentially be tailored more effectively to local needs because of that better local knowledge and adaptability, which in turn could lead to better governance outcomes, more accountability, more transparency, maybe even helping to manage conflict in diverse societies by giving different groups more local autonomy.
Now, something that came up specifically in the context of Web3 and blockchains was aligning incentives. How does that fit in?
This is quite an interesting one. Many decentralized platforms, especially those using tokens or cryptocurrencies, try to build in economic incentives to get all the different participants, developers, building the platform, users using it, people securing the network, all pulling in the same direction.
So the incentives are designed to reward actions that benefit the whole network's growth and success.
That's the goal. It's sometimes framed as a potential solution to the classic principal-agent problem. How do you make sure that the agents, people acting within the system, act in the best interests of the principal, the overall system or its users? By aligning their economic incentives, you try to make doing good for the network also good for the individual.
Clever, if it works. And finally, a big claim is that decentralization can help break monopolies.
Yes, this is a powerful argument, particularly aimed at the dominance of large, centralized entities, whether it's big tech platforms controlling online interaction or traditional utility companies controlling energy.
The idea being that these decentralized protocols or networks offer a fundamentally different alternative.
Exactly. An alternative that operates outside the control of those central gatekeepers. Some argue that traditional regulation often struggles to effectively limit the power of monopolies and can even end up protecting them. Decentralization, in this view, offers a way to build competing systems from the ground up based on open protocols rather than proprietary control.
Okay, so the list of potential upsides is pretty compelling. Empowerment, speed, resilience, transparency, innovation, better services, aligned incentives, challenging monopolies. It sounds almost too good to be true. That can't be all sunshine and roses, surely. What are the catches, the downsides, the challenges?
You're absolutely right. It's definitely not a magic wand. The sources were quite clear about the significant hurdles and criticisms. One of the absolute biggest is simply coordination and consistency.
Ah, yeah. If everyone's doing their own thing, how do you keep it all coherent?
Precisely. It's incredibly difficult to maintain uniform policies or standardized procedures or consistent quality across lots of different decentralized units or a widely distributed system. You risk ending up with a real patchwork.
Leading to operational chaos, maybe? Inconsistent customer experiences, varying standards?
It certainly can. It requires a really, really strong communication culture and robust coordination mechanisms just to try and manage that. And related to this are broader efficiency concerns.
But didn't we just say decentralization can be more efficient?
It can be faster for local decisions, yes, but managing the overall system can become much more complex and potentially less efficient in other ways compared to a streamlined, centralized operation.
Ah, okay. Like maybe the computations in a decentralized network are inherently less efficient than in one optimized central server.
That can be a factor, yes. There's also the risk of duplication, different units maybe having their own separate HR departments or finance teams, duplicating functions and resources, which can increase overall costs.
Or losing economies of scale, as one source mentioned.
Yeah.
Like bulk purchasing power might be reduced if every unit buys its own supplies.
Exactly. So it's not automatically cheaper or simpler, especially in the short term. Another major practical challenge is capacity and resources.
Meaning the local units might not actually be equipped to handle the new responsibilities.
Precisely. If local administrative staff lack the necessary skills or training, or if the technical capacity isn't there, decentralization can falter. And crucially, if they aren't given adequate financial resources to go along with the new responsibilities, especially at the beginning, the whole initiative can be undermined.
And the resources might not be spread evenly either.
That's another risk, highlighted an inequitable distribution of resources across different decentralized units, leading to widening gaps and disparities.
Okay, those are quite practical hurdles. But then there are the political challenges. These seem quite deep-rooted.
They often are. Simply coordinating national policy becomes much more complicated when you have many autonomous or semi-autonomous subnational bodies involved.
And the risk of capture.
Yes, the risk that powerful local elites or special interests manage to capture the decentralized functions or resources for their own benefit, rather than serving the wider community. Distrust between different actors, say, between the public sector and private companies involved in service delivery, can also sabotage cooperation.
And if things go wrong, or there's conflict between units, enforcement can be harder without a clear central authority.
It can definitely be more complex and potentially more costly to resolve disputes or ensure compliance.
One point that really jumped out at me from the sources was about political manipulation. How decentralization itself can become a political football.
Absolutely. It's not always implemented for purely technocratic reasons of efficiency or participation. Political parties might push for or resist decentralization based on how they think it will affect their own power base.
The research mentions smaller parties might tend to favor it more, maybe seeing it as a way to gain influence they lack at the national level.
That was one finding suggested, yes. And the way it's implemented can be heavily influenced by things like the presence of strong regional parties or existing ethnic divisions. It becomes part of the political game.
And, worryingly, some studies were cited suggesting that in some cases, decentralization with more layers of government might actually be linked to an increase in corruption or rent-seeking behavior.
That's a sobering finding. It suggests that simply dispersing power doesn't automatically make things cleaner. Plus, there's the risk that politicians at the center might intentionally starve the lower levels of real power or resources, paying lip service to decentralization while keeping control.
It really shows that the political motives can be quite cynical sometimes. And this connects to another major challenge. Even in systems designed to be decentralized, power accumulation can still happen. The power doesn't always stay distributed.
This is a crucial point, especially relevant to the newer tech systems. How does power creep back in?
Well, the sources mentioned a few ways. It can be technical. For example, in blockchain, mining, the process that secures some networks, nodes that have access to cheaper electricity or faster internet connections, might have an advantage.
Allowing them to gain more influence or rewards over time.
Exactly. Or the design of the protocol itself, might subtly favor certain types of participants, like the producers miners, or maybe large stakers in proof-of-stake systems over ordinary users. Their influence over the network's future could grow disproportionately. And it's not just technical factors, it can be social or economic too.
Definitely. Even if a system aims for completely flat, decentralized governance, the reality is that coordination is usually needed, and that often leads to influence coalescing around certain individuals or groups.
People with strong reputations, maybe, or more social connections, or simply those who have more time and resources to dedicate to participating in governance discussions and votes.
All of those things. One source, focusing on Cardano, specifically pointed out that if participation or influence relies on owning expensive resources, like a lot of the network's cryptocurrency, then decentralization can end up favoring the wealthy, simply because they can afford more of those resources.
So the idea that decentralization is some kind of magical fix that will automatically abolish all existing power structures. Well, one source from the Internet Policy Review suggested that might be a bit naive. Power dynamics are just more complex and persistent than that.
It's a really important reality check. Power finds ways to reassert itself, even in new structures. Switching back to tech for a moment, scalability issues are still a big practical problem for some decentralized technologies.
Right, particularly some of the big blockchains. They struggle to handle huge numbers of transactions.
They can, yeah. When the network gets really busy, it can become congested, leading to long waits and sometimes very high transaction fees, which prices out smaller users. Though it's fair to say, as the A16Z source pointed out, there's a massive amount of work going into developing solutions to improve scalability, things like Layer 2 networks.
But it's still a work in progress.
Hmm.
And then there's a whole minefield of regulatory uncertainty and misunderstanding.
Oh, absolutely. This is a huge one, especially for DeFi and crypto. Regulators worldwide are grappling with how to approach these new technologies.
And the risk is they might misunderstand how they actually work or who the actors really are.
Precisely. There's a danger, as some sources argue, that they might try to apply regulations designed for traditional intermediaries like banks or brokers to decentralized protocols where those intermediaries simply don't exist.
Which could end up placing unreasonable burdens on, say, software developers who just contribute code to an open protocol, potentially stifling innovation. One source had that analogy. It's like blaming the inventors of the email protocol for spam messages.
It's a really tricky area, finding the right balance between protecting users and allowing innovation. It's a major hurdle for widespread adoption. And just wrapping up the challenges, the sources generally emphasize the sheer difficulty of implementing decentralization well.
It's not like flipping a switch.
Far from it. It's often a really complex, sometimes messy process. It doesn't usually happen in calm, stable times either. It often gets pushed through during periods of crisis or major political upheaval.
And it requires a lot of trial and error.
A huge amount. Experimentation, testing things out, adjusting course. There's no single blueprint you can just copy and paste because it depends so heavily on the starting point, the country's history, its political culture, its existing institutions.
Right. So, okay, the potential benefits are clear and pretty exciting. But the practical and political obstacles, coordination, efficiency trade-offs, capacity, political games, power sneaking back in, regulation, just the difficulty of doing it, they're really substantial.
It's definitely a complex balancing act full of trade-offs. To make this even more concrete, maybe we could dive a bit deeper into a couple of specific examples from the sources, see how these benefits and challenges play out in real contexts.
Great idea. Let's start by revisiting finance. Really contrast that traditional centralized model with the vision and the current reality of DeFi.
Okay, so traditional finance, your bank, your stockbroker, the credit card networks, it's fundamentally centralized, right? You have to trust these institutions. They act as intermediaries, gatekeepers.
And that trust isn't always rewarded, is it? The sources pointed out the lack of transparency. Sometimes you don't always see the fees or understand the risks they're taking with pooled money. And the restrictions. That car analogy from one source was brilliant.
Which one was that?
It's like owning a car, but the dealership tells you, sorry, you can only drive it between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on weekdays, and you can't drive it outside this specific county. That's kind of how centralized finance can feel with your own money. Sometimes arbitrary restrictions needing permission.
That's a great analogy, yeah. It highlights the control issue. So DeFi comes along and says, let's build a system without those central gatekeepers, usually on a blockchain.
And the benefits they aim for are things like permissionless access.
Exactly. In theory, anyone with an internet connection anywhere in the world can access and use DeFi applications. You don't need to apply for an account or get approved based on your location or wealth.
And developers can build new things on top without asking anyone.
That's the idea of permissionless innovation again. If the protocol is open, anyone can build a new financial service on it. Then there's the transparency argument.
Because the code is often open source and the transactions are on a public ledger.
Right. So you can, if you have the skills, audit the code yourself. You can see the flow of funds on the blockchain in real time. Proponents argue this leads to more efficient markets because information is more readily available.
And the resilience point we keep coming back to.
Yeah, the idea that these decentralized networks, being spread across many computers, are inherently harder to shut down or censor. One source contrasted the high uptime of major blockchains with incidents where traditional stock exchanges had to halt trading during periods of high volatility. Centralized systems have single points of failure, decentralized ones less so.
DeFi also promises things like global access and maybe creating more unified, efficient global markets by cutting out all the intermediary steps and fees.
That's definitely part of the vision. Larger, more accessible pools of capital, potentially lower transaction costs.
Okay, so that's the promise. But as we said, it's early days. What are the big hurdles DeFi is facing right now, according to the sources?
Well, massive market volatility is obviously a huge one in the underlying crypto assets. That makes it risky. And then there's that huge cloud of regulatory uncertainty and misunderstanding.
Regulators trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
Potentially, yeah. Applying rules designed for banks to software protocols could, as we discussed, really stifle development if not done carefully. There's a real risk of unintended consequences.
And the established players, the big banks and financial institutions, they're not just going to roll over, are they?
Unlikely. As one source suggested, they'll adapt. They'll find ways to compete, maybe incorporate some of the technology themselves, or lobby heavily on the regulatory front. They won't yield ground easily.
And there's also a risk within crypto itself, isn't there? Of companies creating things that look decentralized but aren't really.
Absolutely. The sources warned about this. Just using blockchain doesn't automatically make something truly decentralized. If a company still holds your private keys or controls access to the platform, you're still relying on a central intermediary. It's like that analogy used AOL in the early days, providing curated internet access versus the truly open web that eventually won out. Real DeFi emphasizes user control of keys, not your keys, not your coins.
Right, so DeFi presents this really compelling alternative vision for finance. More open, transparent, maybe more resilient, but it's still very much under construction, facing major technical, regulatory, and competitive challenges.
That sums it up well. Okay, for our second deep dive, let's switch back to governance and specifically look at those complexities around fiscal decentralization in practice. Remember, this is where the power to raise and spend money is pushed down to local or regional governments.
Okay, and the theory sounds good, doesn't it? Proponents argue it should lead to better public services because local officials know local needs best. It should increase efficiency, make officials more accountable to their local voters, maybe even limit the power of central bureaucracy.
That's the textbook argument, yes. Better allocation of resources, more responsive government. But there was that fascinating study from the LSE, the London School of Economics, that looked at what actually happened in Central and Eastern Europe over a specific period.
Right, they look at the data, the empirical evidence, not just the theory. What did they find about fiscal decentralization in that region?
Well, somewhat counterintuitively, they found a negative correlation between the main measures of fiscal decentralization, things like the share of total government spending done by subnational governments, and the share of total tax revenue raised subnationally, and the rate of economic growth in those countries during the time they studied.
Hold on, a negative correlation. So in that context, more fiscal decentralization was linked to slower economic growth. That seems to fly right in the face of the idea that it boosts efficiency and stimulates the economy.
It does, doesn't it? It was quite a striking finding. The study authors acknowledge that while decentralization is theoretically supposed to foster innovation, improve transparency, help tailor services, all things that should be good for growth, actually proving that link empirically in aggregate economic data is really difficult. And in their specific analysis of CE countries, the expected positive growth effect just didn't show up. If anything, it was the opposite.
Wow. So why might that be? Did the study offer any explanation for why the theory didn't match the reality in that case?
They pointed to a couple of potential issues. One key factor they highlighted was the importance of having a clear link, a clear correspondence between the responsibilities given to lower levels of government and the actual authority and resources they have to carry them out.
So if they're told to provide schools, they need the power to raise taxes or manage staff effectively.
Exactly. And the study suggested that in many of the CEE countries, this link was weak. Responsibilities were decentralized, but maybe without the necessary financial autonomy or administrative capacity. This lack of clear linkage makes accountability much harder. Who is really responsible if things go wrong?
And you mentioned earlier the reliance on central government transfers.
Yes, the data in the study showed that in quite a few of these countries, subnational governments were still heavily reliant on money handed down from the center. This suggests they didn't have true fiscal independence, which might have limited their ability to be innovative or responsive, and perhaps kept them beholden to central priorities rather than local ones.
So this LSE example is really powerful. It shows that decentralization, especially fiscal decentralization, isn't some kind of simple policy fix with guaranteed positive results. The real-world impact is incredibly messy, depends hugely on the specific context, how well it's designed and implemented.
And might not always deliver the expected benefits, certainly not immediately. It really underscores that it's a complex tool, not a panacea.
It really does. It highlights that just saying decentralize
Yeah.
isn't enough. The how matters enormously, as do all the surrounding political and institutional factors.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've defined decentralization, looked at its history, explored where it's being applied today, weighed up the strong arguments for it against the equally significant challenges, and examined these specific examples in finance and governance. Where does this leave us? What's the so what? For you, the listener, why should you actually care about getting your head around decentralization?
Well, I think it matters fundamentally because whether you actively notice it or not, this underlying concept, this push and pull between centralizing and decentralizing forces, is genuinely reshaping many parts of your life. And it's likely to continue doing so.
Yeah, think about the technology you use every day, how the internet works, the apps on your phone, maybe future online services built on more decentralized principles, how financial systems might change with things like DeFi gaining traction, how the companies you work for or buy from might be structured, think remote work, distributed teams, and even how your local council or national government operates.
Understanding the principles of decentralization gives you a lens, a framework, to understand the potential upsides in these areas, maybe more choice, more control over your data, more resilience in the services you depend on, perhaps services better tailored to your needs.
But, just as importantly, it helps you spot the potential downsides or limitations we've talked about, the risks of inconsistency, the challenges of managing complexity, the subtle ways power can still concentrate even when systems claim to be decentralized.
It equips you to think a bit more critically when you hear the term being used. Is someone talking about decentralization as a high-level principle, a goal they're aiming for? Or are they claiming something is already fully decentralized in practice? And if so, across which dimensions, architectural, political, logical?
It helps you look under the bonnet, so to speak, to distinguish the marketing hype from the technical or political reality.
Exactly. It allows you to be a more informed participant, a more discerning observer in a world where these questions about how power, control, and information should be distributed are becoming increasingly central. Whether you're choosing a new digital service, thinking about your investments, or engaging in local politics.
It gives you the tools to see the underlying power dynamics at play in all sorts of systems.
And helping you develop those tools ultimately was the mission of this deep dive today.
We've taken quite a journey, haven't we, from getting a clear definition and tracing those surprisingly deep historical roots.
Through exploring its diverse applications today in government, business, tech, finance, energy, and beyond.
We've tried to fairly weigh the compelling arguments for why decentralization matters: empowerment, resilience, innovation, challenging monopolies.
Against those very real and significant challenges. The difficulties of coordination, potential inefficiencies, resource constraints, and the complex political and power dynamics that are always lurking.
And we delved into those specific case studies, the radical vision but practical hurdles of DeFi, and the nuanced, sometimes unexpected findings from research on fiscal decentralization in the real world.
I think it's safe to say it's not a simple black and white issue, is it? It's complex, it's got many facets, and it's definitely a trend that's still unfolding and evolving.
Absolutely. So perhaps here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on after this discussion. Given that inherent tension we've explored, the tension between the kind of efficiency and control that centralization can offer versus the potential for resilience, participation, and permissionless innovation that decentralization might unlock, and acknowledging all the challenges involved in actually making decentralization work effectively, is there such a thing as an optimal balance?
The sweet spot.
Yeah, the sweet spot. And even if there is, how on earth would we decide what that balance should be in different parts of our lives? For the internet, for finance, for how our cities are run, for energy, or maybe that search for a single balance point is misguided. Perhaps, as one source hinted, power dynamics are just inherently messy, shifting, multidimensional. Polycentric was the term used, regardless of whether we label the system centralized or decentralized. Was the key takeaway, the most striking point that stands out to you from everything we've covered today?
Plenty to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.